This week in digital photography, we'll be taking a look at image file formats. Two of the most common image file formats for your digital photography are the JPEG file and the RAW file. There are big differences between the two file formats, so this week we'll be diving into just what those differences are and which version makes the best fit for your photography. When we look at these two file formats, there are really some pretty major differences between them. When we look at the JPEG files, they'll always be smaller and therefore much faster for your camera to save to the memory card. This won't really mean a lot unless you're shooting 10 or more frames per second, shooting hundreds of images without ever letting go of the shutter button. Today's cameras and memory cards are really fast at recording, so these really aren't major deciding factors. JPEG files are also pre-processed. What that means is that the camera will take many of those settings that we have buried deep within the menus of your camera and process all of your images with those settings and save an image that has already been, quote, edited by the camera. Those settings will be baked into the file and you won't be able to edit many of those settings after you shoot the image. The result is an image that generally looks pretty good straight out of camera, and the small JPEG files are ready to be shared on email, social media, etc. RAW files, on the other hand, are much larger files. If you're shooting hundreds of images in a RAW in a matter of maybe a few seconds, you might run into problems where your camera will lock up and it won't let you take any more images until all of those files have been saved to the memory card. Again, this isn't a major deal for most photographers, but it's worth noting. These files, however, will be much larger and will take up a lot more space on your computer's hard drive. It's going to require more RAM to be able to process the files in an editor like Photoshop or Lightroom. These RAW files contain much more data, and that data is pure, unprocessed data. These images tend to look just a little bit dull and flat when you first open them, because things like sharpness, contrast, clarity, white balance, etc. are all still in a very neutral state, waiting to be edited. These files require an image editor with a RAW file converter, something like Photoshop or Lightroom. And many others also have those RAW converters. You can't simply upload a RAW file to Instagram or Facebook. It won't look very good, and social media pages won't be able to handle those files. So let's just kind of dig into the RAW file format. The RAW file is an image file that contains all of the data that is captured by your camera sensor. It's all uncompressed, it's all unedited, it's all unprocessed. This really gives us a lot more latitude for editing the image. This allows you to be able to go back and make changes to things like your white balance, your contrast, your saturation, your exposures after you've created the image that you wouldn't have the ability to change as readily if you were shooting in JPEG. Images shot in RAW, when we edit them in a RAW editor, are considered to be non-destructive, meaning I can go back and change my white balance as many times as I want without affecting the integrity of the actual image file. RAW files also give us a lot more latitude to be able to recover under or overexposed images in your post-processing. So say we go out and we shoot that scene and realize that we really underexposed it by 2 stops. A JPEG file, you might be able to get a third to a half a stop back in post-processing pretty easily. In RAW editing, I've recovered images that have been 3, even 4 stops under or overexposed. So it really gives me much more ability to recover images that maybe were not captured as precisely as they should have been. RAW files really do require you to be doing some post-processing at your computer before they're going to reach their full potential. As we said before, they do require a RAW converter program. And they aren't ready to be shared on your social media pages. But if you're willing to spend a little time bringing out the very best in your image, the RAW file will give you more ability to be able to make those edits after the fact. I often tend to think of JPEG files versus RAW files as kind of like a loaf of bread. We've all had a loaf of bread before, but there's a really big difference between a slice of Wonder Bread that you find at the grocery store versus a really fine artisan baked bread at a small hometown bakery somewhere. They're both made with the same ingredients, but one really takes a lot more time and energy and passion to bring out the greatest in that image. So let's quickly take a look at the 10 reasons that everyone should be shooting in RAW. Number 10, RAW files give you the highest level of image quality. Number 9, RAW files give you greater latitude and exposure. JPEG files are going to record what they consider to be 256 levels of brightness. RAW files can record anywhere between 4,096 and 16,384 levels. Don't worry, nobody's ever going to ask you to remember those things. But the reality is, RAW files definitely give you more latitude in your exposure. Number 8, RAW files give you a greater ability to correct under or overexposure. Again, because of the same thing, you can recover a lot of that under and overexposure. Number 7, you can easily adjust your white balance at any time. So say, for example, you're shooting and you've got your camera set for incandescent lighting, but then you go outside and you continue shooting and you forget to change your white balance. If you're shooting in JPEG, you're not going to be able to recover that white balance. It's going to look very yellowish when you go outside if you're shooting in incandescent settings on your camera. But if you're shooting in RAW and you open that image that you shot outdoors, you can always convert it afterwards to an outdoor white balance setting and be able to recover images that will look just fine when you save them. RAW files give you much better detail. There are incredible sharpening and noise algorithms that programs like Photoshop and Lightroom and others will give you access to in post-processing that you'll not be able to get if you're just shooting in JPEG. RAW files also are non-destructive, so many of those settings like the white balance and the contrast and the color saturation and things like that, they can be edited as many times as you want with a RAW file. So you can play with it as much as your heart's content. You can export those images and then you can still go back into the RAW files and make changes even after you've exported it. So they give you much more ability to fine-tune your imaging. RAW files will also give you better prints because of the different levels of the RAW files. They will give you much finer gradations of tones and colors. So when you take that photo to a photo lab to print, you'll get much more depth and saturation in your colors and your blacks and whites when you're shooting in a RAW file. When you're shooting in RAW, you can also select your color space when you output your image. So your camera will allow you to set things like Adobe RGB or various color spaces, and for the most part they look pretty good. But if you're going to be setting that image off for, say, a magazine and they want things in CMYK, you can always edit your color space when you're exporting from your image editor. So you have your RAW file, you edit to the heart's content, and then when you finally export it to an image format that others will be able to open, you can designate the color space that you want when you save it. RAW does give you an efficient workflow. As I said earlier, it's going to take you some time to be able to edit and process your images if they're shot in RAW, but once you get the right settings for an image, you can actually turn around and duplicate those settings to 100 other images with a click of a button. So if you're going to be shooting large numbers of images under the same lighting conditions, etc., you can actually go in and make that change in one image and then apply that image to all of the images from thereafter, which is pretty handy if you're going to be shooting in bulk. And finally, shooting in RAW is just simply the professional option. Now, there are professional photographers who will be shooting in JPEG. I know several that will, but they have very specific niches in how they like to operate. And for the vast majority of photographers, RAW imaging is just the professional option to shoot. So should you ever shoot in JPEG? Well, sure, there are always exceptions to the rule, and there may be times that you will be best suited by shooting in JPEG. If you are going to be simply shooting and you're not planning on doing any editing, if you are going to simply shoot a whole bunch of images and then you want to be able to turn those over to a client or upload them to Facebook without sitting at a computer to do any editing, then JPEG might be your best bet. JPEGs are also reasonably valued if you're going to be shooting under extremely controlled situations. So this is like, I have a friend of mine who is a professional photographer, and he shoots everything. He shoots a lot of high school sports photos, for example, where he'll end up setting up, a studio with a couple of lights and a backdrop, and everything is, you stand here, you turn this way, you do that, and every image is pretty much the same. So once you get your images dialed in, you get your camera set up just the way you need it, you're going to be shooting 500 or 600 images in the matter of an hour, and you just want to be able to crank those out without having to sit down at a computer to edit every one. Well, then JPEG might be your best option. And finally, if storage space is a huge concern. So, as I said, your JPEG files, are probably 1/20th, 1/30th the size of a RAW file. So if you're going to be shooting hundreds and hundreds of images and you're worried about running out of space on your hard drives, but realistically, external hard drives are incredibly affordable these days. So I would not let that be the deciding factor. But for some people, that's a concern. So if storage on your hard drive is a concern, then maybe you would want to take a look at shooting in JPEG. So that is the rundown on RAW versus JPEG. I think it's pretty clear. I think RAW files are the way you want to go, but you do need to be prepared to do some editing afterwards. So I hope that helps, and we'll see you in the next video.